All right, welcome. We're going to try this again. Hopefully my internet connection is a little more up to speed today. I don't know what was going on yesterday when I tried to do this, but it was like the first time in the 2.5 years we lived here that I had some sort of internet glitches. So I don't know if Blue Ridge caught word that I'm doing a football broadcast and slowed me down so I couldn't, or if it just was coincidental. I really don't know. Anyway, so we're going to try this again this morning. I did hope to do this prior to the kickoff of the high school season last evening, but it was not to be. So actually, I can report in that Cocalico had what looked like a big win over Conrad Weiser. Looked like Noah Palm pretty much dominated the game himself. Also, Manheim Central seemed to squeak out a victory. I think they played Susquehanna Township, and I have no idea how good they are this year, but it seemed rare that Manheim had that close of a game. So maybe they are pretty good in their own right. Anyway, so instead of every team being undefeated like they were yesterday, we now have 50% of the teams undefeated, and the other 50% still looking for their first win. Here in over in Livitz, Warwick beat up on Ephrata pretty good again. I believe Warwick is going to have a pretty good team this year. They have a lot of returning people. They have some good-sized linemen, and they have an outstanding passing game, I believe. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, as far as today's show, my main reason for doing this, and I do have a Facebook website that is, or page on Facebook called Eagle Pride: The History of Cocalico Football. So if you're on Facebook and go to search, probably if you type in Eagle Pride or History of Cocalico Football, you'll find that page, and it has, I haven't added to it lately, but when I made the page up over the first year or two, there's a lot of old newspaper clippings, not yearbook, but program pictures, team pictures, news articles. It's a vast source of information of the history of Cocalico football, actually. So anyway, that being said, this little broadcast today is going to sort of deal with my own memories of Cocalico football. And I'll start out, my dad actually, and obviously I don't remember this other than reading or hearing about it, but my dad played on the 1958 undefeated team under the coach Gailey Weidman. It was, I think Cocalico football started in either 55 or 56, so it was very early in the history of Cocalico football. But when he was in 11th grade, when he was a junior, they did go undefeated. Their main star in those days, in addition to my dad, my dad actually did make an all-state team as a tackle. He was also an extra point kicker. And back in those days, he kicked straight on the old Tom Dempsey style the only difference is my dad had his entire foot as opposed to Tom Dempsey's little stub foot. But anyway, he did kick extra points, and they scored a lot of touchdowns. And that being said, for many years, he doesn't hold it anymore. I don't know who broke it, but for many years, my dad did hold the record for most extra points kicked at Cocalico. And the big star of the team back in those days was a guy by the name of Al Good, who, even with the raft of top-notch running backs that Cocalico had over the years and continue to have up until this day, my dad didn't talk a lot about his playing career, but he did mention Al Good, and he said, these more current guys are real good, but they're not Al Good. So I never got to see him play. I'm sure somewhere there's probably old film in an archive that you could watch. I don't know who would have it or where it would be, but anyway, Al Good was apparently something to behold back in the day. Then, then my dad graduated and got married, had me. So obviously I didn't know a whole lot, or don't know a whole lot, of any history of Cocalico football between when my dad played and maybe when I was 8, 9 years old. I do remember going to games back when Mike Terwilliger and Harold Strunk paired up in the backfield. Two big names of the past. I think they both went on to play in college. I know Terwilliger went to East Stroudsburg, where he had a fine career as a player and also a very lengthy career as a coach. And his son never played at Cocalico, but did have an outstanding college career playing for his dad. But back in those days, again, I was pretty young. I did get to games. My dad used to get to the games at that point. And one more thing about my dad till we move on here. He also was the pretty much the originator of the original Cocalico midget football program. He was a member of JC's back then. There was a sort of like a men's club back then, I guess. And with the JC's, him and a few other guys got together and got Cocalico into the Red Rose Midget Football League. And that version of the Cocalico midget football team went on for a number of years till numbers somewhat declined, and the program actually folded for a few years. And then some other guys, some younger guys, came along and restarted the midget football program, but they play now in I guess it's called the Berks County League. The difference being the Berks County League, it's there's no weight limit to any of the age groups, where in the Red Rose you had to be under a certain weight to play on a certain team. It was a weight age kind of thing, as opposed to strictly an age type of thing. I'm just looking over, making sure my computer still shows me on the screen, and it does, so we're good to go. After those years, I played midgets. And actually, my background, I played 4 years of midgets till I was in 9th grade, and then I played 9th grade at Cocalico, and then my high school career was the football seasons of 76, 77, and 78. And in my 10th grade year, the team itself, outstanding team, made up of a great group of senior athletes. I think the entire starting offense and defense, there was only one underclassman, a junior at the time, one of the toughest, scrappiest per pound players I've ever known, Bobby Hemling. He started at running back, and I think he was the only underclassman that started out of the 22 starting positions. Like I say, they had a great group of athletes. It was early in Coach Kaufman's career, and no offense to Coach Kaufman, they won, well, actually tied for the Section 3 championship. But I believe that group of guys probably could have went out and won 9 games without having a coach. They were an extremely talented group of guys. That being said, when I was in 10th grade, I really didn't see the field at all, maybe at the very end of a game or two. But so when they won the section championship, even though my name was on the roster, I never really felt like I had a whole lot to do with it. As a matter of fact, when we got jackets from the Reamstown AA, and we also got trophies, and I'm not sure where they came from. I still have my jacket, but when I went home after getting the trophy, I hung on to it for a little while, a couple days, a couple weeks, and I never really thought I had a whole lot to do with it, and I threw the trophy away, and figured, if I get a trophy, I at least want to have some kind of feeling like I earned a thing. So anyway, then in my 11th and 12th grade years, we did not have very good records. In fact, each of those 2 years, we only won 1 game. And part of what I attribute that to, other than the fact that maybe we just weren't all that good, back in the 1977 basketball season, Cocalico won the state championship. And actually on the football team that same year, 2 of the starters on that basketball team also were on the football team and were big parts of it, Joe Becker and Pat Ross. And so they played football and basketball. And then all of a sudden, Cocalico became a basketball school after, everybody was on board after they won the state championship. So a lot of the best athletes probably in the class behind me and my class, they went and played basketball year round. And therefore, the football team, we didn't have a lot of the better athletes in our class come out for football. And I'm sure some of them would have definitely helped our chances, but it was what it was. And they all played basketball, had fine seasons, never won the state championship again. But, it was sort of sad that we didn't have some of the best guys in our class out on the football field. As far as me, I missed half of my senior year. The second half, I ruptured my spleen. So the thing was, for the first, whatever it was, 7 years of my career, I was always a lineman. Offense, defense, I played center. Actually, if I had a strong suit as a lineman, it really wasn't blocking or tackling, but I was, for some reason, very good at long snapping. So I did the snapping for punts and for the few extra points we attempted that year. And finally, in my senior year, or actually probably midway through my 11th grade year, I always wanted, actually, to be perfectly honest, I really didn't necessarily like football as a whole. I mean, I played, I tried, but I sort of wasn't all that great as a lineman. And I think part of it was I really didn't want to be a lineman. Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to be a running back. And the only thing I ever really can say I enjoyed about playing football was when I actually got to carry the ball. And so in probably midway through my 11th grade year, Coach Dave Lars, who has since unfortunately passed away, but it was really him that gave me the opportunity during tackling drills. He was a defensive coordinator, line coach, and when we would do tackling drills amongst just the linemen, I never was very good at tackling, but when I would run the ball to be tackled, which is what I enjoyed doing, I always did well at that. And finally, he must have decided probably on two reasons. One, I just wasn't really all that good at being a lineman, and he probably wanted me to go with the running back so he didn't have to deal with me anymore. But he did give me a shot. I mean, he must have talked to Coach Kaufman, and they moved me. I was allowed to play running back in JV games that year. My 11th grade year, I still played varsity on Saturdays, but on Monday evenings, I got to be a running back, and it was great. And once I knew I was going to be a running back my senior year, I finally put in a lot of time over the summer and, was having a decent year. I actually, I guess if I have one claim to fame in my high school career as a running back, and I'm certainly nowhere close to 90% of the running backs that went through Cocalico, but I did gain 100 yards against our arch rival, Ephrata, as a senior. It took me, I think I carried the ball 32 times that game, which probably was a record for a while as far as attempts. And I gained, I think, 101 yards. So I was never going to break away on a 60-yard run. But I will say I don't ever remember fumbling, and I don't know that I ever actually lost yardage on any attempt. I was Phil Kaufman's epitome of 3 yards in a cloud of dust. Obviously, whatever I averaged that game, I probably averaged about 3.5 yards when I gained that 100 yards. I just carried the ball a lot, but I loved it. It was what I loved to do. And then unfortunately, in a game against Elko, 5th game of the year, I ruptured my spleen, and that was pretty much the end of my high school career. I did end up walking on at Millersville. I actually made the team, and probably 4 weeks into the season, part of them being preseason, I injured my ankle, and it wasn't a terrible injury, but I was out of practice for maybe a week, and it was at the same point of time where I just wasn't cutting it in school. My major wasn't really what I wanted to do, and so while I could get some of my tuition back, I bailed out, and that was pretty much the end of my football career. until in 85 and I think 92, Cocalico played two separate alumni football games. It will probably never, ever happen again due to insurance liability and that type of thing. I think the first game we actually used equipment from Stevens Trade School, and that game we played against Garden Spot, and we won that game. I think it was, well, we scored once. Actually, this jersey that I'm sporting today is actually the jersey that I wore in those alumni football games. And being a trivia guy, I do trivia shows 3 times a week in the local area at 3 different venues. Trivia question that I would be the answer to is, out of those 2 alumni football games, who is the only person for the Cocalico squad to ever score touchdowns? And your answer would be me. So I did score in both the games. The second game we played against Ephrata, we actually lost that game, but I did score a touchdown in that one as well. And those 2 alumni games were so much fun. I got to play with some younger guys that, you know, had super careers after I played in high school. Even had a couple older guys, at least in the first one. I think the second game, I may have been actually the oldest guy on the squad. But anyway, so that's my claim to fame, so about equal to Al Bundy's high school career at Polk High School. But as we move on then away from when I was in school, the first couple years, I actually didn't even go back to games. I guess I was still sort of, you know, hurting from missing half my senior season. So for a year or 2, I just sort of stayed away. And then after that, I got involved. I wasn't really well, I certainly wasn't a paid coach, and I wouldn't have even called myself a volunteer assistant. I was more like a kid who just wanted to sort of get back out on the field. So I would go over to summer practice at the high school when they had 2-a-days in August, and then even into the fall, I would go over, I'd hold tackling dummies, I'd, you know, do things to help out at practice. Had a ball doing that. I got to, you know, there was teams at that point. I remember the 82 team, I didn't really help out. I went to some practices. The 82 team, well, it would have been the class of 82, the 81 season, had a very, very good team in their own right. Again, it was a very senior heavy team. They may have only lost 1 game. I know they lost to Upper Marion. I remember in that game though, down at Upper Marion, one of the Upper Marion running backs broke away on a pretty long run, and he was pretty far ahead of the field. And I remember Rod Shupp caught the guy, which was a play that stood out in that game. He caught the guy. The guy had a 15, 20-yard lead on him, and he caught up before the guy got to the end zone. That team had a very good team. And then a couple of years following that, it was decent teams with actually a very good team with Steve Sawyer at quarterback and Todd Grill at running back. And that was one of the years where I actually helped out pretty much all year with the team. Again, just as a, I would keep stats on the sideline and that kind of thing. And that was a lot of fun. Back in those days, there was a fullback by the name of Mike Lucky, who was sort of a pretty stout, tough kid back in those days. And me and him used to, I would have this big forearm pad and I'd rush the passer and he'd block me. And we would have a lot of fun, a lot of tussles at practice. And, that, like I say, they had Todd Grill was an excellent running back, but I also remember being at practice back in those days. And there was a young guy, I think he was in 10th grade at the time, and his name was Trey Ryan. And I remember sitting on the bench just watching some drill or whatever. And I made mention to somebody that, as good as Grill is, this Ryan kid is probably going to be as good. And as it turned out, he really was. I remember a game at Columbia where he pretty much almost the game that Noah Palm had last night was probably very much in line with the game that Trey Ryan had at Columbia. He had all kinds of yardage, total yardage. I think he ran back a punt, ran back an interception, had, I don't know how many yards rushing, but it was like a career game that Trey had that night at Columbia. Then I sort of, there was a couple of years where, again, I really didn't attend a whole lot. And then started to attend games again, probably around the time when Cocalico had Randy Hall as a running back, and there was another kid in the backfield. Forget his first name. He was a Brubaker kid. And I think it was the year, I think Tab Musser was a sophomore that year. And they had quite a team. In fact, that team, I remember I was at the game at Elko when they were playing Bishop McDevitt in the first round of the district playoffs. And of course, they were, a huge underdog. Bishop McDevitt had some recruit from Notre Dame and some other big name players. And, it was probably one of those games where I, was very glad to say, hey, I was at that game, because Cocalico scored right near the end of the game and needed a 2-point extra point to win. And they went for two, and I'll credit Coach Kaufman with that. I can't see how he would have done anything else, but he did go for two. They made it. And in what was probably the biggest upset in the history of Cocalico football, they did beat Bishop McDevitt that night. And did go on to win the next couple games and get to actually the state semifinal against the always tough Mount Carmel team. I think they played up at, might have been Juniata High School. Not positive of that, but I remember being at the game, and the thing I took away from that game as a Saturday morning coach, it seemed like in that game they just got away from what got them there. I don't know why, but it just seemed like they tried to do things that weren't normally Cocalico's game plan, and I'm not sure they would have won either way. But it just seemed to me like they were trying to, I guess, outsmart Mount Carmel by doing things they weren't expecting them to do. But in my mind, what it did, because they weren't used to doing certain things, maybe throwing passes or whatever, they themselves, obviously weren't as good as what they would have been if they just would have stuck with their grinded out ground game in that game. But anyway, they did make it to the semifinal. And then after that, then Tab Musser, who I mentioned, and he became the next in line of a lot of great running backs, and he was one of the better ones. In fact, it always surprised me. Now, he did play at Clarion, I think, but as good of a high school senior year as that kid had, I would have, and maybe he didn't want to. I don't really know him. Maybe he didn't even care to go to a bigger college. But he would have been one where I would have thought, hey, this guy can probably, be a Division I college player. I mean, he was big, he was fast, he was strong. Probably the highlight of a game I was at that he was playing in was the game they played over at Lebanon Stadium against Lebanon Catholic. And at the time, Lebanon Catholic had a guy by the name of Tommy Long, who was for a short while. I don't think he is anymore. Maybe he is. But he was the athletic director right here in Ephrata. But in his high school career, he was a storied running back from Lebanon Catholic, set all kinds of records over there. But on the night that Cocalico played them over at Lebanon, Tab Musser rushed for, I think it was 406 yards that game. And the thing was, he really didn't play much of the fourth quarter. The kid probably could have rushed for 600 yards in that game. And again, it was one of those games where I was, happy to say I was there when it happened. I did attend a fair amount of high school games over the years. I used to go to the Big 33 game back when it was at Hershey, played in the middle of summer. I would go to some of the local all-star games more recently over at Manheim Central. Now, I haven't been to a game in the last 2 years. I do occasionally watch on Blue Ridge. They do a fine job of broadcasting on Blue Ridge, probably a better job than PCN does for their football games. The other enjoyment I find out of the Blue Ridge games, in addition to actually watching the game, I get a real charge out of listening to Coach Kaufman in the booth. He sounds exactly the same as when he was in the locker room. I just, things he says, his mannerisms, he hasn't changed, and that's not a bad thing. But I get a kick out of listening to him because it takes me back to the days when I played, and even to this day, even though you dreaded practice during the time you were at it, those August two-a-days. Every time this time of year comes around, I still, to some degree, miss it. I'm a little old to partake anymore, probably, but I'd have to think twice if there was another alumni game. It would be one of those deals where I'm not as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was type deal. I'd probably think about playing at least a couple plays. But anyway, back to the game scenario. As I said, I would go to a lot of games. There's a lot of Cocalico players that I remember. I'm not going to mention them all because the list is way too long. But Ricky Uberoth went and played at Temple. Mark Whitmer played. I think he played Division I down in Mississippi somewhere. Some other players. Mike Schenk was a player back in the day. He actually, even though he was good at football and he was a big guy, he actually went on to be a superstar in slow pitch softball. He's actually in the Softball Hall of Fame. From what I was told, he was once in a softball home run derby in the stadium, the Dome Stadium in Minnesota, and supposedly hit a softball in that stadium further than any professional baseball player ever hit a hard ball. The guy was a monster on the softball field. But he was a Cocalico football player. More recently, you had Brett Janis, who also unfortunately has left us. Brett Janis was a great two-way player, as was his younger brother Jet, who did for a while go to Oregon on a track scholarship, then came back to Millersville, and he actually got on the field, I believe, as a football player at Oregon once or twice, and then came back and actually played football at Millersville. But I remember there was a couple games that he pretty much single-handedly won when he was in high school for Cocalico, and he played with my nephew Mitch Schober, who went on to play at Juniata and currently coaches at Cocalico. But there's just too many players to even mention. Cocalico has quite a tradition of football, and carrying forward even to this day. Now, in addition to that, some other games I was at that are very memorable. I remember going up to Shamokin when Manheim Central was going to play Berwick, and up to that game, Manheim Central, Berwick was like the thorn in their side. They just they would dominate teams, but they just couldn't beat Berwick. In fact, at one of the big 33 games I went to, Ron Paulus, who was a quarterback for Berwick, and this would have been before this game at Shamokin, but he went on to play at Notre Dame and in the pros, and I was at the big 33 game that he was quarterback for, the Pennsylvania team. But anyway, the game at Shamokin, Manheim, Berwick, I actually took off work of that Friday, drove up to Shamokin, got to the field at Shamokin at probably 11:30 in the morning. This is a 7 o'clock kickoff. And when I got there, I was not the first person there. I mean, there was already a line of maybe 10 Manheim Central fans. But anyway, we hung out. I walked around town for a little bit, came back, resumed my spot in line. And Manheim that night did actually finally end up beating Berwick. So I was at the Manheim game when they finally beat Berwick. I believe that was, it was the year, I think, after they won the state championship. Jeremiah Hunter and his brother were on the team. Then they mysteriously appeared at Manheim, played for a year or two, I think 2 years, and then mysteriously went to Harrisburg. I don't know if Harrisburg offered him a bigger contract or what the deal was with that, but they did go on to Harrisburg. In fact, the older brother, Jeremiah, I think he went and played at Iowa in college. They were good players. It was just sort of a mystery where they came from and why they left, but they were there at Mannheim for a little bit. But actually, the year before, I saw Mannheim back a couple games when Jeff Smoker was the quarterback. I remember being at a game at Wilson, and it was Mannheim Central against Wilson, and Smoker was a quarterback for Mannheim, and I believe the running back at the time for Wilson was Pete Gilmore, who went on to Penn State. Never really made it big there, but he did play for Penn State. Some other memorable games. I was at a Mannheim game. It wasn't like it was a blowout by Mannheim, but it was at Mount Carmel's Silver Bowl up in Mount Carmel, like a historic football site in the state. If you're into football and you never saw a game at the Silver Bowl in Mount Carmel, do yourself a favor sometime and cruise on up there and take a game in. It's a neat place. You stand on the side and look right down into the town, basically. Another memorable game on the run to Mannheim's state championship season. The semifinal was against Strath Haven, and it was at Coatesville. The game was canceled on Friday night, dude. I think it was pouring down raining. They moved it to Saturday afternoon. And this was when Strath Haven, their big star of the time was Dan Connor, who had quite a career at Penn State, and I think still to this day plays in the NFL. Well, he was their fullback and a linebacker for Strath Haven. And on that day, it wasn't raining, but it was super windy and frigid. The weather was horrible. I remember in the game, Mannheim did win the game 3-0. Obviously a defensive battle. I remember at one point in the game, Mannheim had a 4th down and probably 4th and 10, let's say, from their own 15. And Mike Williams decided not to punt because I honestly think if they would have punted, the ball would have blew backwards. It was that windy. They did go for it. I think they actually made that 1st down, and that was probably a big play in the game actually that they did decide to go for it. And then they moved on to the next week in what a game I was at, their Snow Bowl in Hershey for the state championship against Pine Richland. And you probably talk to people today, and there's probably a million people that say, "Oh yeah, I was at that game," and that was not true. There was not a ton of people at the game. I remember I have a Jeep, and I left home from over in Rossville, and we lived over there, and got to Brickerville at 322 and 501, and I think there must have been an accident on 322 at the time, so it was blocked off. So I just kept going straight on 501, and then I in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, do I just want to turn around and watch this game on TV? And well, I didn't. I persevered, got to Hershey, and there was people there, but it was not near the crowd it would have been in a good weather situation. The Pine Richland fan buses, I don't think even got there till like right before the game. In fact, their team bus, I think, got there considerably late. But I'll say this, that standing in those stands, and again, I'm a Cocalico grad, but so when they're playing Mannheim, I hate Mannheim, but when Mannheim's playing somebody else, I have no problem rooting for Mannheim. A lot of people hate Mannheim, and they hate them because they're constantly good. And I don't understand why they hate them. The reason they're good is they're committed. They put in the time, the effort. They have tough kids. And I admire their program. And, in a lot of these other programs who always are complaining about them, instead of complaining and bitching and moaning, put in the work. If you want to beat them, work at it. Get as good as they are. Do what they do. Don't complain about them and expect them to take a knee on you. And anyway, so I go to this game, and it was the most surreal environment. Triple overtime win for Mannheim. A guy by the name of Sean Wilt blocked the extra point in triple overtime. And from rumor had it that if Pine Richland would have made the extra point and tied the game, they were going to call the game, and it was going to be a tie for the state championship. I really don't know if that's 100% true, but that's what the rumor was, that if it was tie after that 3rd overtime, due to the weather, they were just going to call the game. Well, it ended up not being a tie, but it was the most back and forth game in the snow. I mean, it was just the neatest environment I was probably ever in for a football game. And, I was glad Manheim won. I mean, it wasn't an easy win for them. In fact, on the Pine Richland team, their wide receiver in that game was a guy by the name of Neil Walker, who then went on to have he still plays. He had quite a baseball career for the Pittsburgh Pirates. He don't play for the Pirates anymore. I don't even know who he plays for, but I think he's still in professional baseball. But he played wide receiver for Pine Richland in that state championship game. I actually have the game the entire game on a VCR tape that one of the times they rebroadcasted it on PCN, I recorded it. So I still have it, and I have watched it once or twice over the last 10, 15 years. If there's one game I'm glad I was at, in addition to the Bishop McDevitt Cocalico game, it was that Manheim State Championship game, more for the environment than really the game itself, although it was probably the best state championship game, triple overtime. There hasn't been any before or since to that degree that I'm aware of. So anyway, that's pretty much going to wrap up my broadcast here. I have a little note here that I made up for myself so I didn't ramble on forever. And one thing I did miss, I was also at a couple Wilson games during the career of Chad Henne, who's playing for the Kansas City Chiefs right now. And one of the memorable games was a game between Wilson and Reading High at Wilson. I forget if it was Henne's junior or senior year, but Reading at that time was also a very good football team. And they had a guy by the name of James Bryant, who went on to play at University of Miami. He never, I think he just had a hard time staying out of trouble. But he was a man amongst boys on the high school football field. And there was one time in that game where Henne they were like at the 5-yard line, and I think Henne scrambled around and took off, and James Bryant just laid the hammer on him. James Bryant was a guy that I don't think I would have wanted to, as much as I enjoyed running the football, I don't know that I would have wanted to get tackled by James Bryant. But so I've had the luxury of traveling around locally to a lot of games. Saw a lot of people who went on to be big stars in college and even in the pros. But I still enjoy the high school game. Like I say, I don't get to a lot of games right now. I do watch a couple on Blue Ridge. I guess maybe when they see this broadcast, maybe I'll get invited to be a guest in one of the booths during the games one of these weeks. Reunite with Coach Kaufman in the booth. That'd be like on my bucket list. But anyway, speaking of Blue Ridge, in the past, the last couple years, when Cocalico plays Manheim Central, I have done I would call it a live blog on my computer where I would watch the game on TV, and those out of the area that can't get Cable 11, I would basically just sit on my computer and update the game as it was happening via typing. And I'm not a typist, so, it wasn't very elaborate statements, but I tried to keep everybody, old Cocalico players and fans, up to date from outside of the area. Now that I got this webcam, my thinking is I think Cocalico plays Manheim Central September 27th, a Friday night. If at all possible, what I plan to do is have the game on my TV here, because it is going to be on Blue Ridge Cable, and you will be looking at me, but I will be describing the game as an announcer as the game is happening. So basically, if you're interested in that, like I say, I'll fill you in as it gets closer, but I do plan to actually do a live podcast during the Manheim Cocalico game and pretty much be like play-by-play or color guy, filling all you out there in Facebook land in on the game as it happens if you cannot get Cable 11 and watch the game yourself or go to the game in person. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I got a mainspring effort, a trolley pub crawl coming up 4 o'clock this afternoon that me and my wife and a couple friends of ours are going on, and that should be an enjoyable. The day looks like perfect weather out there. So get out and enjoy it, doing whatever you want to do. And I'll tune back in here probably next Friday or Saturday. Saturday may even work better. I glance over there and I actually see a bunch of people listed at least that tuned in for a minute or two, maybe listen to this whole thing. But anyway, when I sign off here, I'm going to walk over there. I'm going to save the video to Facebook. And so if you missed it or want to watch it in full or whatever, it'll be on my Facebook page saved as a video for future reference. Anyway, I'm not sure what next week's topic is going to be, but I will see you next week. Have a great weekend.